Well, hi there, I'm Noah Bradley, and this is Handmade House TV. On this week's episode, we're going to talk about board and batten siding. Stay tuned. Well, once again, thank you for tuning in here to Handmade House TV. I'm out on my lake property today, and I'm trying to wrap up the installation of the board and batten siding on the back little addition I'm putting off of this log shed that I'm building. Board and batten is a wonderful method of siding any outside structures that we might want to put together. It's a very standard country feel method of siding outbuildings, sheds, garages, barns, you name it. There's something very woodsy about it. You can use lumber directly from a sawmill, so you can save money. It's an easy application. It's basically just nailing up the first board and then butting the rest of them to it and wrapping around your house until you're finished. So it's a great homeowner type form of siding of a structure. And I highly recommend it. I've used it many times. Of course, like everything in the world of construction, it has its pros and cons. The pros, one of the pros that we just mentioned was it's easy to use, and also it tends to be fairly inexpensive because we can do it ourselves and because we can use a locally acquired lumber from our sawmill. Some of the negative aspects of it is, first of all, it is a very rustic look. If we want to build a rustic log cabin, then having some outbuildings that look a little rustic as well tends to really blend in with it. I typically, when it comes time to doing a log cabin, if you're doing an addition to it, I prefer a little bit more of a lap siding rather than board and batten. But if you're trying to maintain that feeling of rusticity in your log cabin, then it's just fine with that. The one place that I do not ever recommend using board and batten siding is on the gable ends of your log cabin. That triangular space, roof space that's above our logs. Historically, I have seen well over 1,000 vintage log cabins, and I have yet to see a single one that had board and batten siding up in the gable ends here. Now, they would use a board sheathing underneath of the lap siding, but typically it's always been lap siding over top of any sheathing in a log cabin. It's a much nicer look. It does a much nicer job. And then that's another one of the negative aspects of board and batten siding, and that is that water and insects tend to get behind any gaps that might occur in the batten. Now, what is a batten? When we're putting up the boards, first of all, we're basically just putting up one domino after another around our house, and the boards, as they age, will shrink. And also, as the seasons pass, they tend to expand a bit and shrink a little bit. In other words, there's gaps between each of the boards. So we cover this gap over with small strips of wood called battens, and that keeps out things for the most part. But unfortunately, wood tends to move, especially natural wood, and gaps tend to happen, and that insects get behind here, and air tends to penetrate in between it. So it's not the best siding in the world. Now, on this little log shed that I'm building here, I'm using actually two different species of wood to take care of it. You really want to go with knot-free wood. You don't want your house to look like a leopard, so you want with all spots and everything everywhere. So you want to use a nice, relatively knot-free wood. And to be honest with you, for the most part, it doesn't matter which species you use, as long as it is a stable species, one not prone to twisting and warping. So on the back side of this, I'm using poplar. Now, poplar has a lot of virtues. It's locally abundant here. It's tulip poplar, and it's easy to come by. It's extremely stable. It behaves itself really well, with the minor exception that if you buy it from a sawmill, it never fails that each end, about a foot off of each end of it, will crack. that seasoning happens faster in the ends than it does in the rest of the length of any board, and so it tends to dry out quicker, and so there's often a large crack that will appear in the ends. So typically I like to buy my poplar siding and let it age for a year or two before I actually use it in an application, and then I cut that waste part off. It makes great kindling. And then I use it. Now, if you want to use green wood, then I would recommend cutting it long when you apply it to your house, and then count on doing a final cut after the wood is seasoned a little bit and cut off that cracked wood. Now you can, and it's always a good idea to, right before you put your wood up, to do a little bit of sealer on the end grain to slow down some of this rapid drying process. I'm not doing it on this particular structure because I'm planning on leaving the wood entirely 100% natural. I'm going to let it age just like I did the logs. And so that means that I don't want to apply sealer, because it never fails. I'll slap a little bit on the surface of the board, and then I'll end up with a little bit of staining. And since the wood is already pretty dry, I'm not really worried about that. And to be honest, if it gets a little crack or two here, it's a shed, so I'm not overtly concerned about that. Poplar will hold up extremely well if it gets wet and if it drains off quickly, as in siding. I've done this before, natural and with totally untreated, never painted, and it will last. It'll last for many, many, many decades. And so there's not a concern about that. The problem with poplar is that it will not hold up well if it ever gets wet, and it cannot quickly dry out. And so if you're in an application where on this side of the structure, I'm actually going to build a little deck off of this, so water will come off of the structure itself and land right on the deck, and so the end grains of the poplar would be right next to the deck flooring. Would be a very moist environment. Chances are the poplar would absorb this moisture and hold it, and therefore the bottoms of the boards would probably rot off in a matter of 10 years. And would need to be patched or repaired or replaced. So on both sides of the structure, I'm actually using a species around here. It's known as ash. It's the same wood that baseball bats are made out of. It's a fairly durable wood. It's not the greatest wood in the world for water exposure, but it sure beats poplar by a whole lot. And also, it's a color. It comes white when it's fresh out of the sawmill, but it ages and it will develop a color that's extremely similar to the poplar. So 99 out of 100 people would never ever notice the difference in the wood here. So ash on both sides, poplar on the back. I could go ash all the way around. To be honest, I could probably go poplar all around, and it wouldn't need to be patched for a long time, and it would just be fine. Now, when it comes time to the idea of if you want to paint your board and batten siding, which gives a really professional, upgrades it, upscales it a whole lot in doing that. My current home is a board and batten home that we painted it, and it looks pretty nice. It was a structure that designed to look very nice, very refined, and that the board and batten tend to mellow that out a little bit. It tended to countrify it. So when it comes time to choose the boards we want to use for our board and batten siding, we want to go with relatively knot-free. We want to go with a species that best suits our particular weathering needs, but also we want to choose lumber that is as wide as possible. When we are covering each of the gaps between each of the boards with battens, we don't want each of the battens to touch together, and we lose the overall visual appeal of board and batten siding. So typically I would avoid anything, say 6 inches or smaller, with thinking that 8 inches is probably your minimum width. Probably 12 to 14 is your optimal. Good luck trying to find a 14, but so most of the time you'll end up with 10 to 12 inch, which is probably ideal. Now, also, I can say that I've done both. I've done structures where all of the boards were exactly the same size, and it tends to look a little monotonous. It looks a little bit manufactured. So a random selection of boards to when you're putting up the board and batten is ideal, in my opinion, rather than it being too perfect. When I say random, I really do mean random. Don't go with a 12-inch piece, 10-inch piece, 8-inch piece, 12-inch piece, 10-inch, 8-inch, and continually cycle it over. Really try to mix it up as much as you can, and you'll really appreciate the overall effect. And one of the key insights, it holds true for board and batten siding as well as logs, and that is one way of making a large log look really large is to put smaller ones next to it. So when you are creating something and you're using, say, 12-inch boards on your siding and 8-inch, when you put an 8 on one side or on both sides of that 12, the 12 is going to look that much bigger, that much more impressive, and make your overall home that much more appealing. One other thing that I could point out here with board and batten siding before we go is that typically in a lot of the farm structures, in this structure that I'm building here, there's so much freedom in building a shed that it's just I just love it. But if you get out and you start exploring old farm structures that were built with board and batten, is that you discover that board and batten siding is actually structural. You're working with real live lumber. There's probably more lumber in an old chicken coop built in the 1950s than there is in the modern home. And that is that when you put each of these boards up there, you really are strengthening the structure of your home. You can't say that about vinyl siding. And so if you carefully look at a lot of these old farm structures, you realize that they build the floor system, and then they build enough posts in order to hold up the roof system, and then there's not a whole lot of studding available, a whole lot of vertical pieces running up and down. And the interesting thing is that when you're putting up board and batten siding, you're putting up a lot of vertical pieces. So you're only adding to the strength of your whole structure when you're doing it. So as you can see, the board and batten siding, as I'm putting it up, I have rafters at the top to nail it to, the floor system at the bottom to nail it to, and there's not a whole lot of, well, there's nothing to nail the boards to anywhere in the middle of that. And what I am intending to do is that I'm going ahead and putting the siding up now, and then I'm going to install shelving on the inside, which will act as horizontal nailing members for the siding to keep it all nailed tight and pulled together. So it's a board and batten structure tends to be more of an integral unibody form of construction than does new modern construction. And if you frame out your home as a modern home with studs every 16 inches on center, you're going to have to install a lot of horizontal nailers between each of the studs in order to have a nailing surface in order for you to apply your board and batten siding. Whenever I'm doing board and batten siding, I always start at the corners, get them as tight and straight as I possibly can, and then I fill in between them. I would like to show you one country boy technique of obtaining just the right angle when you're putting up board and batten siding and it's meeting an irregular angle, such as here on this shed as I meet the rafters up top. Now I could use a tape measure and measure the distance on where both sides of the board comes as it comes up to the top. Or I could pull out an angle gauge, which is what most carpenters would use today, and then transfer that angle over to our board. But if you're working out in the woods and you don't have all your tools with you, the simple technique, the country technique, is just to tack the board up in place, and then you find another board, short little scrap piece, and you transfer the line from the angled roof down onto your board. Now, as you can see here, I used the wrong size board. It wasn't ideal. I would have ended up with too short of a board for the siding, and so I just scouted around and found a shorter piece of scrap and then made another mark on it. Then I carried it over to my cutting place and cut the board to the right angle, and then I brought it back here and I tried it out, and it fit just perfectly. In a future episode, we'll talk more about the battens and exactly how to size them up and how to put them up on your structure. It's my opinion, it's very critical. It's a very minor detail, and some people will fuss about it, especially the nailing pattern, and too many people ignore the sizing of the battens. But both of those are actually fairly critical things, and we'll talk about that then. On next week's Handmade House TV, we're going to take care of that last tricky board, particularly here on this structure. Whenever we're building an irregular structure such as a log cabin or a stone home, something with an irregular surface on it, and we're trying to merge some kind of shed addition into it, regardless of whether that is an addition with lap siding or board siding or it's a timber frame, we're going to have to scribe fit a board in order to meet this irregular surface. And so on next week's episode, I want to show you exactly how I do that. I do hope you're enjoying all of these construction techniques that will help you in building your own future handmade shed as well as your future handmade house. If you'd like to know the thorough package, if you'd like the best of what I have to offer, something that I cannot possibly present here on YouTube, it's far too much content. If you want to know how to build a log cabin from scratch, beginning to end, one that you will love, you need to see the Handmade House Academy. If you want to know how to do the perfect stonework on whatever you're building, whether it's a log cabin or it's a normal house or a timber frame house, or maybe you're building a stone house, then the Stonemason Academy is for you. There's a lot of great lengthy, detailed instructions that have obtained a lot of great reviews, and I invite you to come over and take a look and learn more about them at handmadehouses.com. And while you're there, go ahead and sign up for my free newsletter, and you'll get more information, more tips, more insights into what I'm actually up to on the future construction of my property here at this little lake. Anyway, you guys take care. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you here next week on Handmade House TV. Bye now.